formal already that start the meeting. So good afternoon to you. This is Christian Ramiscal. I'm one of the officer of the IEEE EMBS here in Phoenix chapter. We started chapter last September, and this is one of our task is going to be monthly topics. For in line, before I start introducing our distinguished speaker, if you can kindly mute your phone or your computer if you're not speaking, we would appreciate it. Other than Eric, of course, Eric will be our speaker. Questions will be we'll take it at the end of the meeting. We'll have 5 to 10 minutes for question and answer. So you can also type the question. I'll be monitoring it on the question, and we can ask questions for Eric Mas. So let me introduce our distinguished speaker right now. Our distinguished speaker right now is Dr. Eric Mas. He is currently the Senior Director of Design for Six Sigma and Design for DRM for Medtronic Restorative Therapy Group. He's responsible for developing and leading a strategic plan and focus for most of company, the chief architect of Medtronic's DFSS, DRM, BB, and MBB programs. Eric was recognized with Medtronic's Individual Star of Excellence Award for 2012 and has been recognized as Medtronic Technical Fellow. He is actually also one of our life senior member in the IEEE. So that is one of his, one great achievement there. Furthermore, Eric joined Medtronic in 2009, and after 30 years with Motorola, in roles ranging from research and development through manufacturing to the directors of operations for a $160 million business and director for design and system engineering for the wireless group of Motorola, SPS. Eric is also a co-founder of Six Sigma Methods at Motorola and had been the lead master black belt for design for Six Sigma at Motorola. He has a book applying DFSS to software and hardware system, which actually I have. Thank you for that. And I have your autograph as well. That provides a clear step-by-step guidance on applying for Six Sigma for developing innovative and compelling new products and technologies, while managing the business schedule and technical risk. Eric received his bachelor degrees in biological science from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, his master's degree in biomedical and chemical engineering from Arizona State University, and his PhD in industrial and system engineering from also Arizona State University. Dr. Mas also currently serves as an adjunct professor at ASU, Arizona State University, and as a chairman of Industrial Advisory Board for the NSF-sponsored Brain Industry University Collaborative Research Consortium. So without further ado, I'll give you Eric Mas.
Well, thank you, Christian. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Okay, so yes, you saw the title in the announcement. So predictive engineering, going from deterministic to stochastic modeling, but you'll see I'll actually be using the word probabilistic rather than stochastic in my presentation. They're kind of synonyms. So from deterministic to stochastic modeling, predictive engineering to develop compelling new products. And I have a little picture over here that I'll actually use, I think, in one of my later slides. This is actually for a regulator for a medical device. So anyway, with no further ado, as we said, so let me give a little bit of context to my talk. And I'm going to mention this book right here. See, I have all books all around me. I showed my own book when Christian mentioned my book. So this is a book called The Undoing Project with a subtitle, Friendship That Changed Our Minds. And you can tell that Michael Lewis is a famous author because the font size for his name is as big as the font size for the title of the project. And yes, in fact, if you look on the back cover of this book, you'll see that some of his earlier books have become movies. The Big Short, now a movie. Moneyball, which you see on the left-hand side over here, now a major motion picture. And The Blind Side, which is also a movie that I think won an Academy Award. So Michael Lewis wrote The Undoing Project in response to criticism from about his earlier book, Moneyball, now a major motion picture, which I'm going to summarize on the next slide. And so this is Michael Lewis on page 17 of The Undoing Project, explaining why he wrote this book, The Undoing Project, A Friendship That Changed Our Minds. And so once the dust had settled on the responses to his earlier book, Moneyball, one response from a pair of critics remained more alive and relevant. They said that the author of Moneyball, referring to Michael Lewis, did not seem to realize the deeper reason, the ways in which any expert's judgments, I'm going to come back to that word expert in a moment, the ways in which any expert's judgments might be warped by the expert's own mind have been described years ago by a pair of Israeli psychologists, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. So Michael Lewis was intrigued, and he started looking into the life of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and he found some interesting little point. How on earth does a psychologist win a Nobel Prize in economics? You know, normally if you win a Nobel Prize in physics, you're probably a physicist. If you win a Nobel Prize in chemistry, you're probably a chemist. And if you win a Nobel Prize in economics, you're probably an economist. But in 2002, the Nobel Prize in economics went to Daniel Kahneman. Amos Tversky had passed away, so Daniel Kahneman there is receiving the Nobel Prize in economics in 2002. So when the answer to these questions emerged, there was another story to tell. So what these critics were mentioning was in the book Moneyball, they talked about how experts basically being baseball scouts, because it's a book about baseball scouts with the Oakland baseball team, and how they were some of the other baseball scouts of other teams were making some bad decisions, even though they were experts in judging baseball talent. And that's not what Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky were speaking of. They were talking about other kinds of experts as well, or people in general, that their judgments are warped by their own mind. In fact, Amos Tversky was invited at the largest emergency room trauma center in Canada, because where every second's count in an emergency room, sometimes the physicians, definitely experts, emergency room physicians, experts, they were sometimes making bad decisions for the same reason. Sometimes the experts' judgments are worked by their own mind. And so they'd study this. So why did they win the Nobel Prize in economics? Well, basically, they also showed the experts were wrong in the world of economics. Economics was assuming how we make decisions, how we make financial decisions in particular, and they assumed something called rational choice theory. And basically, Kahneman and Tversky overturned rational choice theory. We do not make economic decisions or other decisions rationally. In fact, we make them irrationally, but predictably irrationally. In fact, that's the name of a book. They established a new field of economics called behavioral economics. And one of the new professors in this new field, Daniel Ariely, a professor at Duke, used to be a professor of behavioral economics at MIT, but now he's a professor at Duke. So he wrote a book about it called Predictably Irrational, about how we make decisions in our lives. So basically, later on, Daniel Kahneman wrote a book for the common public, but in the meantime, he'd written technical books, like he edited this book, Heuristics and Biases, the Psychology of Intuitive Judgment. So they found that, Kahneman and Tversky found that we had actually two ways of thinking, but the majority of people and the majority of the time do what, in this book, Daniel Kahneman referred to as thinking fast. But the term they use, as you see in the other book I showed you, is actually thinking in terms of heuristics, heuristic thinking. Heuristics is a fancy word for rules of thumb. So basically what they found was we're not making decisions according to rational choice theory. We make decisions based on rules of thumb. Like if the price is too low, there's got to be a catch. Or if I don't know what to do, well, follow what other people are doing. Or if I don't know what to do, what do the experts tell me to do? I'm going to do what the experts say. Or something that I figured I might as well add in here. I just added this to the slide this morning. Something that is getting very relevant now that we're in this political season. Something called confirmation bias. So there's heuristics and biases. The actual heuristic is consistency. People want to be consistent. They don't want to be hypocrites. They want to be consistent. And that leads to a cognitive bias is basically a heuristic misused, and that consistency as a heuristic turns into confirmation bias. So the way that shows up politically is people who are Republicans and conservative tend to watch certain TV news channels like Fox News, and people who tend to be liberals, progressives, Democrats tend to follow other news to confirm or be consistent with what they already believe, and they get their already existing biases confirmed by what they read in certain websites and what they see on certain news channels. So that's very much relevant. And these are all part of heuristic thinking. So those of us here in IEEE, EMBS, we actually had another kind of thinking that Daniel Kahneman refers to. We were trained in another kind of thinking that in the book he refers to as thinking slow, but I'll refer to it as model-based thinking. So most of you on this call probably have some family and friends who are engineers or scientists like yourselves, or STEM people, science technicians, science, technology, engineering, math people like yourselves. And you probably have some friends and relatives who are non-STEM people. And you may notice a difference. Perhaps if you haven't already noticed it, maybe after this talk today, you may start noticing it. A difference in how your engineering kind of friends and relatives approach decisions or problem solving compared to your non-engineering people. And that's something that Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky were talking about. So the people who do not have that engineering kind of training, they approach almost everything using heuristic thinking. All the decisions, problem solving, they use heuristics. But in engineering school, we learned model-based thinking. So what do I mean by model-based thinking? So models are basically abstractions from reality. Sometimes we deal in what we learned in terms of physical models. We might have a physical model, an architect might have a scale model of a building he's going to be designing, or a civil engineer might have a scale model of a bridge that he's involved with. Over in Medtronic, over in Memphis, Tennessee, where we work on therapies for the spine, we actually have a larger scale model of a spine where you can see our devices, how they go into the spine to help correct different problems with the spine. So we have physical models we sometimes use as abstractions from reality, and we learn from working with these physical models. Sometimes we work with, excuse me 1 second here, see if I can close this out. Sometimes we work with mathematical models like ideal gas law, PV equals nRT, or Ohm's law, voltage equals current times resistance, which I think I'm going to use on a later slide, or the diode equation, I equals IS e to QV over KT minus 1, or other equations, Arrhenius equation, whatever else. We use mathematical models as abstractions from reality and get some deeper understanding using those mathematical models. Sometimes we use simulation programs. In electrical engineering, we may use circuit simulation programs like SPICE or like the Cadence design tools. Or in the mechanical engineering world, where you might do finite element analysis. These are abstractions from reality. So before I go on, I'm going to make one little comment, a little bit of a story about myself. So it turns out I actually have a little bit of a problem with my left leg, and I go into physical therapy generally about once a week. And so, about 9 months ago, back before all this COVID-19 changed the world upon us, I was going into physical therapy, and it was fairly crowded. There were a lot of physical therapists and a lot of patients undergoing physical therapy. And I had just been invited to be the keynote speaker at a conference in Las Vegas on reliability. I was going to be the keynote speaker on a conference on reliability in Las Vegas, no less. And I was rather proud of this. So I tell that to my physical therapist as she's working with me, and she asked me what my keynote speech will be about. And I'm trying to think about terms that you would recognize. So I said, well, it's basically about modeling. And suddenly the room went totally quiet. I had everybody's rapt attention. Everybody in the room was staring at me. They were thinking, modeling. No, unfortunately, I wasn't talking about that kind of modeling. I was talking about something a little bit less glamorous. I was talking about engineering modeling. And here we are. This actually, you'll be seeing a picture of this later on. This is actually modeling the heating up of a device that I'll talk about later on in TELUS when it's being recharged. Or here's a circuit model. That's engineering modeling. Or modeling up as a defibrillator gets ready to defibrillate the heart. So I'm talking about engineering modeling. And then, of course, everybody in the room went back to their normal things because it was not as exciting as about talking about fashion modeling. So anyway, as I mentioned, the book Thinking Fast and Slow talks about thinking fast being heuristic thinking. And one version of thinking slow that I'm talking about right now is model-based thinking. But the model-based thinking we learned in college was what I'll refer to as deterministic model-based thinking. If you put in these inputs, you will get out these outputs. If you drive over a nail, you will get a flat tire. If you put in the set of ones and zeros, you will get out this other set of ones and zeros. And no reason to do it more than once. If you do it 10,000 times, 100,000 times, you will get the exact same result. That's deterministic model-based thinking. And that's what we learned in college, was deterministic model-based thinking. But what we're going to talk about today in terms of predictive engineering, and I'll show that on a later slide, is going from deterministic model-based thinking to probabilistic model-based thinking. The formal term for it is stochastic model-based thinking, but I prefer the term probabilistic model-based thinking. And by the way, this is something that Kahneman and Tversky were talking about. In fact, here's a quote from 1972 by Kahneman and Tversky, Kahneman, winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002. Back in 1972, 30 years earlier, man is a deterministic device thrown into a probabilistic universe. And that's the world we're dealing with medical devices. It's a probabilistic universe. Not all the physicians are going to always do things exactly the same way. Not everybody's anatomy is going to be exactly the same. Not everybody is going to be the exact same age. And not every part that we manufacture is going to have the exact same properties. It's going to be all sorts of variation. And we have to deal with it probabilistically. And we have two ways that I'll be talking about today to work with things, go from deterministic model-based thinking to probabilistic model-based thinking. One way is with Monte Carlo simulation. So here's an example. We have a circuit simulation, a model, a circuit simulation, and we bring in a variation with Monte Carlo simulation. We predict the distribution of the outputs. And I'll go through an example like this a little bit later on, but this is Monte Carlo simulation. So that's one way of going from deterministic modeling that we have with electrical simulation and making it probabilistic. And another way of going from deterministic to probabilistic is with Bayesian methods. And I'll mention, and I'll show this slide again a little bit later on. I'll talk a bit about going from deterministic to probabilistic using Bayesian methods, Bayesian belief networks and such. So those are the two methods I'll be mentioning today to go from deterministic model-based thinking to probabilistic model-based thinking. So the first one I mentioned was Monte Carlo simulation, and I'm going to give you a quick history about Monte Carlo simulation. Monte Carlo simulation was developed during World War II as part of the Manhattan Project that developed the atomic bombs. There you see a picture of the atomic bomb. Fat Man was its nickname. So the Manhattan Project had ENIAC, one of the very first computers in the entire world, in the entire history, ENIAC. ENIAC was developed by this man over here on the right, John von Neumann. See, there he is with ENIAC. He look like a proud daddy with his cute little baby. Okay, there he is. So John von Neumann knew somebody who could program ENIAC, a man by the name of Stanislaw Ulam. So Stanislaw Ulam used ENIAC to run a series of simulations on the achievement of critical mass, not to be confused with my last name, critical mass, but critical mass. And he named this methodology Monte Carlo simulation, and he named it after the probability of winning at Monte Carlo casinos. And there's a picture of a Monte Carlo casino in Monaco in Europe. All right, so Monte Carlo simulation is a statistical or probabilistic modeling method that takes a deterministic model and makes it probabilistic to estimate the distribution of your outputs. I'll call them Y's. And the output can be the project schedule, the distribution of probable schedule time when you'll finish your product, or cycle time when it's in manufacturing, or the probability of on-time delivery, or the probability of getting certain financial results, or the probability of performance, or the probability of reliability. This example I have right here is a real example I did from my Motorola days, where my key requirement was total radiated power out of a cell phone. And I was able to show that the distribution, some of it was going to be out of spec. The red area is out of spec. And I can show the sensitivity for Monte Carlo simulation. What source of noise was causing most of the variation? Well, it was attenuation proximity to my big fat head. That we refer to 89% of the variation of total radiated power. So what you get out of Monte Carlo simulation is the mean and spread and the probability, 74% probability of being within spec, a level of confidence like that 74% of the product's performance meeting your requirements within the spec limits, and it identifies which of the factors or X's, in this case attenuation proximity by a big fat head, has the biggest impact on the variability or uncertainty of your output total radiated power. So that's Monte Carlo simulation. So when I first joined, when I tried to join Medtronic right out of college, when I got, as Christian mentioned, I got my master's in chemical and biomedical engineering with an emphasis on biomedical engineering back around 1979. And I tried to join Medtronic back then because they were all about 2 miles away from the ASU campus where I graduated from. And they turned me down. You don't have any experience, whatever else, good grades, no experience. And so I went instead to Motorola. And as far as I know, I was the only biomedical, in 1979, I was the only biomedical engineer in a sea of electrical engineers. And all those electrical engineers were thinking deterministically as they were taught in college. So, for example, I would imagine in a lab where you're looking at Ohm's law, voltage equals current times resistance. So with a little bit of algebra, current equals voltage divided by resistance. And so you go in the lab, take a 1.5 volt battery, put it across a 1 kilo ohm resistor, and according to Ohm's law, as expected, you measure 1.5 milliamps and you write up your report. But coming out of biomedical engineering and with a bachelor's in biology, microorganisms, plants, animals don't always behave deterministically. They have sort of variability. For me to draw any conclusions, I had to use statistics and probability. So I was thinking about it more this way. The battery voltage is not exactly 1.5 volts. It might be 1.47 volts or 1.51 volts or 1.51 volts. That 1 kilo ohm resistor is not exactly 1000.000 ohms. It may be 1001 ohms or 997 or 998 ohms or 1002 ohms. It's got some distribution. And when I try to meet it on the ammeter, it'll have a little bit of parallax, a little bit of measurement error. So that has a distribution as well. So I can combine them all together mathematically and say, really, the current has a distribution. It might be somewhere between 1.44 milliamps and 1.56 milliamps. And so that's the way I looked at things. And all these electrical engineers were looking at me like, are you crazy? But wow, this is kind of cool stuff. And we've had some very big successes in going from deterministic thinking to probabilistic thinking in the early days of Motorola. And we'll talk about some of these successes in a little while. But going on from there, the other way I learned, the first time I ever learned or became aware of this deterministic versus probabilistic way of looking at things. So I'm older than most of you on the call. And so I actually remember this event back in 1964. For many of you, this is ancient history because anything before you were born is, of course, ancient history by definition. So 1964 is before most of you were born, but I actually was a little kid in 1964. So in 1964, we had what I call the smoking causes lung cancer controversy because Dr. Luther Terry, shown here, the Surgeon General of the United States, stated smoking causes lung cancer. Both of my parents were pretty heavy smokers. Most of their friends were pretty heavy smokers. And I remember listening to them talk as this came out in 1964. They're all in my living room talking to each other and they're very confused. And my parents and their friends are saying things like, well, how can the Surgeon General say smoking causes lung cancer? We're smokers and we don't have lung cancer. They were thinking in terms of deterministic causality, that the input always leads to the output. Smoking 100% of the time leads to lung cancer. But Dr. Luther Terry was not referring to deterministic causality. He was referring to probabilistic causality, that they were able to show using Bayesian methods that the probability of death from lung cancer for heavy smokers was more than 20 times higher than the probability of death from lung cancer for non-smokers. Using probabilistic causality, in this case, using Bayesian methods, which I will mention a little bit later on, Bayesian methods. So, predictive engineering is what I refer to as the melding of the engineering modeling we learned in college that was deterministic with probabilistic thinking. And this picture over here, this form of this diagram, was the original definition of design for Six Sigma. So yeah, I was among the founders of Six Sigma. Six Sigma was announced to the world in 1986. I had the first published article on Six Sigma in 1987. But about a year earlier than 1986, in 1985, a gentleman by the name of Tony Alvarez and I sat down and said, so Six Sigma was only an internal Motorola thing in 1985. And we were talking, well, what would it take to make something be Six Sigma level of quality before we launch it, rather than having to fix it after the fact? And we drew a diagram kind of like this. And basically, I'm going to describe it to you right now really quickly. So we said we have all the requirements. That's represented by these little line segments. And maybe if there's too many of them, we focus on a vital few. So those two lines over here. And we want to have good confidence we're going to meet those requirements. So we flow them down to the factors that affect them, the control factors and the noise factors that affect our requirements. And maybe we have, in this case, I'm showing 5 of them as 5 little line segments. And maybe we do a designed experiment, fractional factorial design, a screening design, and we find out of those 5 factors that could be significant in affecting our requirements, maybe only 3 of them actually are significant. So that's what I'm trying to show you with these bolded lines. And so for the ones that are now to make it probabilistic, for the bolded lines, for the bolded factors, the factors that are actually significant, we come up with their distributions. What are their uncertainties? Some of them are noise factors that are pure distribution. Some of them are combination of control and noise factors that have a setting, but also have variability around that setting. So we have these distributions of our inputs. Then we take our deterministic model that we get out of a circuit simulator or whatever else, and we run these distributions of inputs through an equation derived from that, and we predict our distribution of the output using Monte Carlo simulation. So that's one way of doing it, is we can use the distribution of inputs, kind of a brute force method. Monte Carlo simulation is kind of a brute force method. We vary the inputs and we see what happens with the variation of the outputs. And if the distribution of the outputs is well within spec over the range of these noises, these uncontrolled factors over the variation, then we're good. And we say, hey, product looks good. But if not, then we optimize our inputs until we have good confidence that over the range of things we don't control, we will have a good distribution of our outputs. And we can do that with Monte Carlo simulation combined with optimization. We can also do this with Bayesian methods that I'll mention later on. But Bayesian methods are kind of interesting. You see with the arrows, it's bidirectional. You can go from inputs to outputs as Monte Carlo simulation does. But you can also say, this is what I want my outputs to be, and drive it backwards and say what your inputs need to be to achieve that. And so it's actually kind of bidirectional with Bayesian methods. Anyway, but I'll start with Monte Carlo simulation. So I'm going to start with a product which I have an example of somewhere behind me. There it is. So Micro. This is the first device at Medtronic that used predictive engineering, my topic of today, extensively. And you'll see some of the examples momentarily. See, here's Micro. It's a pacemaker that goes inside the heart. The first pacemaker, that everything before that, all the pacemakers were external to the heart with a lead that went to the heart. So Micro was used predictive engineering extensively. And I'll start with the first thing, which is how this thing attaches, these little tines over here, how they attach to the heart. So basically, we started with the voice of the customer, which is shown at the top in this bluish area over here. And we translated them into measurable technical requirements at the system level. So, in order for it to be small, it had to have a small volume. That became less than 0.75 cc. And since it's cylindrical, which you see a picture on the lower right, it's cylindrical, then we need to make sure the length and the radius are consistent with being the small size, less than 0.75 cc. So that put a requirement on the length, less than 24 millimeters, and a requirement on the radius. And then that flowed down to a requirement on the die stack thickness. We want to minimize the risk of the patient. That flowed down to requirements on reliability and longevity. There was requirement on reliability. I'm going to show a little bit of a flow down on that, but that flowed down to requirement on the fixation mechanism, how this would attach to the heart. The longevity flowed down to requirements on longevity, which I actually will show you. I think I have a slide on that, the longevity of it. Then we had to make sure that this device actually provides therapy for pacing the heart, and that requires the requirement on the pacing voltage, and that flowed down to requirements on the regulator that set that pacing voltage, and that flowed down to requirements on the use conditions and the control factors, the noise factors and the control factors, which you see down here, and I'll mention that in a moment. And then the physician wanted to have ready access to diagnostic information, so that put a requirement on the antenna, which I'll show you an example of in a little while. But let's start with this fixation, and this is a project by Arshad Al-Foka, one of our early DRAM black belts. So this is a video made with University of Minnesota showing how it would be used, Micro would be used to go inside the heart. And see, let's imagine we put it inside the heart. Here's they're doing it with a pig heart, with an actual living pig, putting one inside there to try how it works at the University of Minnesota. So imagine where they place it in the heart the first time, it's the wrong spot. It won't do a good job of pacing the heart. So you need to recapture it. Well, when you recapture it right there, you don't want to tire the heart muscle. And that put an upper spec limit of 3 newtons on the fixation force. Now you reposition it, and now you put it in a spot where it will do a good job of pacing the heart, and you want it to stay there forever. So now you're going to do a little fixation verification, make sure it's going to stay there for years, and that put a lower spec limit of 2 newtons of fixation force. So with that kind of in mind, so the lower spec limit is 2 newtons. Below that, it might come loose. The upper limit is 3 newtons. Above that, you might have problems. You might tear the heart muscle if you wanted to reposition it. And they established those spec limits with use condition studies with porcine, that's pork heart tissue. And they did this, they got good calibration between what they were doing with actual heart tissue and with finite element analysis, the mechanical simulations they were doing in parallel. They got them to have good correspondence, reducing the model error, the difference between the model and reality. Then they flowed down those requirements. That's requirement flow down to the factors that could be significant. And they floated down with a P diagram. So here's that study you saw on the noise factors. You have variation on the noises, including primarily the manufacturing variation. And then we had primarily 3 control factors: the thickness of the tine, the length of the tine, and the radius of curvature of the tine. And the intended result safely attached. Unintended states, detachment below 2 newtons, and above 3 newtons, damage to heart tissue if you had to reposition it. Those were the error states or failure modes. So based on that, designed experiment. So here's that picture you saw again of the tine with its 3 parameters: thickness, length, and radius of curvature. If we just had one factor, it could be represented geometrically with a line segment: thickness low, thickness high. That's the tine thickness. If you only have 2 factors, tine thickness and tine length, you could represent it geometrically with a square: low and high thickness, low and high length, 4 combinations, 2 to the 2, 4 combinations. With 3 factors, tine thickness, tine length, and tine radius of curvature, geometrically we represent it with a cube: low and high thickness, low and high length, low and high radius of curvature, with 8 combinations. So here are those 8 combinations that they ran through the finite element analysis mechanical simulator. And for each of those combinations of thickness, length, and radius, the finite element analysis that was calibrated to correspond very close to what they saw with porcine heart tissue, the pull force, the attachment force, was predicted out of this model. But this is at this point still a deterministic model from those 8 combinations. I'm showing you that little cube up here with those 8 combinations. So they got them over there. And now we analyze this designed experiment. So doing it first without a center point. So pull force, it has a positive slope with respect to thickness. Higher thickness has higher pull force. Pull force versus length, kind of flat. Not much slope to it. That was not significant. Pull force versus curvature, that radius of curvature, that had a negative slope and pretty significant. So we got rid of the factors. Only 2 of the factors were important: thickness and radius of curvature. And now we added a center point. Well, by the way, this is out of the analysis out of Minitab. And you see here's length is B, and that's not significant. It's below this dashed red line of significance. So A is significant, C is significant, the AC interaction, thickness and length. A is thickness, C is length, C is radius rather. Thickness and radius are significant, and the interaction A times C, thickness times radius, are significant. But B and everything involving B, the radius, is not significant. So we removed that. But now we added in a center point. And the center point, you see, does not fit on the line, so we could not go with a linear model. So if we wanted to get a good model for how fixation force went with thickness and radius of curvature, we needed to have something more than a linear function. And the way to get more than a linear function is an extension of design of experiments called response surface modeling, abbreviated RSM. So we added additional star points. We augmented those first 8 runs, the DOE, to make it a response surface modeling. We added that center point that I mentioned, and then we added what we call star points, 6 star points represented over here with these 6 red circles. These are the star points. The center point is a blue circle, and then the original DOE are shown with these little yellow circles at the corners of the cube of the 2 to the 3rd factorial design. So now we can reanalyze this and get a quadratic equation, a polynomial. So for some reason, I just skipped over that slide. Let's see if I can go out of slideshow mode, see why I'm skipping over that slide. Oh, I must have deleted it. Well, anyway, so we brought that in there, and we now modeled it, what would turn it from that equation from being a deterministic model to probabilistic by allowing for the manufacturing variation on the thickness and the manufacturing variation on the radius. And what we found is, using Monte Carlo simulation, a high percentage of the time, it would be below 2 newtons and we'd have a failure. So we found a way to optimize the thickness and radius of this design, shown here, so that we get really good capability well within the spec limits of 2 to 3 newtons when we put this into production. So we did that to optimize microfixation. We did similar things for that longevity that I mentioned before. And here's a work from Charles Gordon, now director of test engineering at Medtronic Tempe campus, but at the time a design engineer. So on the micro, he analyzed the fixation, how long it would last. And he was able to show this is with Monte Carlo simulation. This is with equations that he was able to derive. And he was able to do Monte Carlo simulation and show that would last 10 years with a really high confidence in terms of the battery life. So that's the longevity. And then Ryan Vogt, who's about to become a DRAM master black belt using these methodologies. This is black belt project. He worked on the medical telemetry. The physician wanted to have ready access to diagnostic information. In order to provide that information to the physician, we needed medical telemetry, in this case telemetry B, which had some requirements on the antenna. So he worked with the supplier, Vishay, did a P diagram to identify the control factors and the noise factors for each of 3 of the requirements. And then he worked with the supplier to optimize with high CPK means really good. CPK of 2.3 is really good. CPK of 5.66, really good. CPK of 3.69 was able to optimize all the requirements associated with the antenna so that they could have confidence that the physician would have ready access to diagnostic information through this medical telemetry B. So that was Ryan Vogt's black belt project. And then for the regulator, we had an intern named Ryan Fosworth work with an experienced engineer, Naveed Alam, to make sure that we had good pacing voltage, good requirement on the eye draw that related to the current drain for longevity, but the right output voltage, having it stable and not having any ripple, and that flowed down to control factors and noise factors. So we kind of modeled that using a circuit simulator, the cadence design simulator, allowing for the variation, the manufacturing variation, including variation of these complete noise factors like threshold voltage out of manufacturing for the N channel, P channel, and how much current you're trying to draw out of this regulator. And it showed that as it was originally designed, some of these things would be out of spec. The eye draw, the current being drawn would be out of spec, showing it in red, and stability, some high percentage of the time would be out of spec, wouldn't be stable enough. So he found optimal settings for the circuit design that he would have good CPKs, would always be within spec, 99.9% of the time, whatever else. So he was able to show how to optimize the regulator for micro. So that melding of engineering modeling with probabilistic thinking is predictive engineering, and I've been showing some examples of using Monte Carlo simulation. Now I'm going to move over and using some Bayesian methods, still on that same project. So the first example of using Bayesian methods was back on that microfixation. We wanted to have high confidence that this was safe. And some people just do like an FMEA, but we built a Bayesian model for it. Mike Campbell actually did. Mike Campbell built a Bayesian model for what might happen over the years that this would be implanted in the device, whether or not there'd be fractures on the tines, whether things, and he related the hazards to minor complaints and calculated out using this Bayesian probabilistic way of looking at it, the probability of pulmonary embolism, the probability of harm from extraction, the probability of death for the patient, the probability of infection, and then optimize, minimize those risks for the patient with design. Similarly, Mark Porter, working with Yan Lu and one of my interns at the time, Sarah Burke, work on a problem we had with accelerator, maybe the accelerometer rather, that would detect the patient whether they're running or sleeping. So you pace the heart differently if somebody's running or if somebody's sleeping. And if the accelerometer doesn't quite work, you don't detect the patient's activity and you don't pace the heart appropriately. And one of the risks about it not working correctly is called stiction, where the accelerometer got stuck in place and no longer detects whether the person's running or slowing down. And so he built a Bayesian model using a tool called a GeneRisk for the probability that it would get stuck in vivo in the patient. And he was able to show that the probability of this happening in the patient was about 12 in a billion, 1.2 times 10 to the minus 8, about 12 in a billion. We figured that was probably an acceptable risk, but nonetheless, we worked with the supplier to lower that probability of stiction even further. And basically, when Medtronic negotiated with the FDA for the size of the clinical trial, we shared these, and there are other groups besides this. I just showed you a sampling of the DRM predictive engineering projects. DRM is Medtronic's term, design reliability manufacturing projects, these predictive engineering work with the FDA, and we impressed them with the level of predictive engineering work. And based on that predictive engineering work, some of which you've just seen, the FDA agreed to reduce the size of the clinical trial in half, from 1,200 down to 600 patients. So the product came out, worked beautifully. It's been one of the big success stories of Medtronic, and the U.S. News and World Report named it 2016 biggest achievement in medicine. Here's actually from the U.S. News and World Report. Science fiction becomes science fact. 2016 biggest achievements in medicine. Number one, wireless leadless pacemaker, the first leadless pacemaker manufactured by Medtronic. So there it is. And some people were concerned that using this predictive engineering was going to slow us down. In fact, Micra came to the market in the European Union 6 months ahead of schedule, and also in the US 6 months ahead of schedule. So in fact, it actually made us go to market faster using predictive engineering, in part because we were able to reduce the clinical trial, but also we had less build, test, fix, rework cycles in our product development process. So that melding of engineering modeling with probabilistic thinking that we refer to as predictive engineering. So a little bit of a few examples about reliability. Reliability is essentially a predictive metric. So predictive engineering is totally appropriate on the reliability side, because reliability, probabilistic thinking, is the probability of success over the lifetime where we use the product. But thinking about probability is not comfortable for most of us. As Kahneman and Tversky, I'm repeating the quote from them, man is a deterministic device thrown into a probabilistic universe. We're not used to thinking probabilistically, but reliability kind of forces us in that discomfort zone of thinking probabilistically. So quick little story here. So just before I joined Medtronic back in October 2007, Medtronic voluntarily recalled Fidelis lead, a lead that attached a pacemaker or defibrillator to the heart. So this is this is 2007. You see a little diagram over there. And you see Medtronic stopped 11% when we had that voluntary recall of the Fidelis lead. The market value decreased $6 billion. So a couple of years pass. I'm in Medtronic. My boss, Chandra Subramaniam, has been promoted to VP of R&D for CRHF, Cardiac Rhythm and Heart Failure Group up in Minneapolis. And he asked me to spend some time with each of the groups in CRHF, including the group that developed the Fidelis lead that had this massive recall that had this terrible impact on Medtronic. So I spent almost 2 days with that team. And at the end of the 2 days, the leaders of the therapy delivery system group, that's what they called themselves, pulled me into a meeting room and they said, so Eric, now that you spent a couple days with our team, what do you think? And this is almost verbatim what I said. I would say that organizations, like people, often have personalities. And when I think about your team, therapy delivery system, the term that comes to mind is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And they all kind of stared at me. And I said, even if I didn't know this is the group that had the Fidelis recall, I could tell by working with them the last 2 days. It's like hanging like a cloud over everybody on the team. They feel direct responsibility, which in some sense I guess is good, but they feel real responsibility for the fact that they had this horrible event, this recall of a product that they developed. So the manager said to me, so assuming you're correct, Eric, what do you suggest? I said, right now, everybody just wants to avoid the topic. Nobody talks about the Fidelis lead. It's just a painful memory. Rather than avoid it, I would suggest you confront it. I would suggest you ask the team to look at the data they had when they released the Fidelis lead, look at it again through a predictive engineering lens. And that is what they did. They built a Bayesian reliability model for the leads, bringing in those use conditions of variations, using an approach called Markov chain Monte Carlo. This has actually been published. And these are the people from therapy delivery: Tara Kadad, Adam Himes, Mike Campbell, fracture prediction of cardiac lead medical devices using Bayesian networks. And they compared it for a good lead that didn't have a recall and the Fidelis lead. And you see the picture over here. This is the good lead at the bottom, Quattro. Survival over years. This is survival, reliability is the y-axis. Over the years is the x-axis. And here's Fidelis. And see that little red arrow over there? They would have predicted the recall had they used predictive engineering. And ever since then, they have been using predictive engineering. And they published this paper. That group over there is now co-authoring papers with the FDA. Here they are. Here's an article incorporating virtual patients into clinical studies by those same people, Adam Himes, Tara Kadad, and some other people working with 3 members of the FDA. And here's another article, now since published, incorporation of stochastic engineering, another term for predictive engineering models as prior information in Bayesian medical device trials, co-authored by 2 of our predictive engineering DRM master black belts, Tara Kadad, Adam Himes, with 3 people from the FDA. And the FDA has been interested in doing this kind of DRM stuff since Halloween 2011. Here they talk about 7 major opportunities for improving quality, specifically validation of actual use, design for reliability manufacturing, that's DRM, and software robustness. So talking a little bit about more reliability for implantable devices. So here's Micro, here's Intellis. I've just been talking about Micro for a moment. Let me talk a little bit about Intellis. So here's some work by one of our DRM master black belts, John Liu. So she built a Bayesian model for Intellis reliability. Here you see a picture of the output of it. Here's her model. Then in a tool called a GeneRisk, Intellis reliability prediction. And the interesting thing about it, she predicted reliability. She was able to do that prediction with a sample size less than 1/7 of what it would have done using traditional reliability prediction methods. So she was able to do it with a much smaller sample size using Bayesian methods. And so that's not the only thing we did on Intellis using predictive engineering. So here's that picture you saw over there, Intellis reliability model. We also looked at the predicate product called the Restore Sensor, and found that a lot of complaints from customers were about how long it took to recharge it. This has a rechargeable battery. And see over here, the major complaints: recharge burden, recharge related issues, heating during recharging. So we used predictive engineering, and this is the model I showed actually at the beginning, for how much it would heat up. And we figured out how to keep it safe, not have it heat up too much, and reduce the recharging time from the predicate product Restore Sensor taking 4 to 6 hours to taking less than 1.5 hours on Intellis. We also used DRM on the design side, saved the design turn, made it robust against mechanical drop shocking, and also used it on the manufacturing side. This is the first time we ever had a new product out of that part of Medtronic with yield above 80%. When it launched, 97% cumulative yield. That was unheard of, but we were able to achieve it using predictive engineering. Here's another. This is a medical device that's used in an operating room called Stealth Station S8. Again, showing the reliability side and availability side. One of our people built a use condition matrix to look at those noise factors that affect reliability. We also did a Pareto of complaints from the predicate product, Stealth Station S7. That earlier product, this is Stealth Station S8. And then he built a reliability model and optimized the reliability for Stealth Station S8. And he was able to get the mean time between failures from 1.9 years on the earlier product, more than doubling it to greater than 3.9 years for Stealth Station S8. So we also did on Stealth Station S8. Evan Patel worked on it on a software project, did a P diagram looking at the control factors and noise factors. And one of the issues was latency, a delay between when the surgeon does something and it shows up on the screen. Doesn't want it to be noticeable. It would be noticeable if the delay or the latency is more than 250 milliseconds. And the original software, original design, more than half the time, it had noticeable more than 250 milliseconds latency. So he was able to optimize the software, and he did RSM and optimization of the software. And he was able to get it that only 5% of the time would it even be noticeable by a physician, being more than 250 milliseconds latency. I already talked a little bit about the reliability. That was Richard Haig's Blackbelt project. And we also did on the manufacturing side, Lucasero. We were able to save $500,000 in the first year alone. They're overall on Stealth Station S8, 5 black belt projects, 6 green belt projects. So the team actually had a nice little exciting little thing. It turned out that Hollywood asked Medtronic, hey, we are getting ready to make a movie that involves a neurosurgeon. Can you give us the most latest and greatest equipment? So we loaned to them a Stealth Station S8. So Stealth Station S8 was shown in an early scene in the movie Doctor Strange. Here's a scene from Doctor Strange when he's a neurosurgeon before he has his accident and everything else in the movie Doctor Strange. So of course, everybody at the Louisville site where they designed and built Stealth Station S8, they all went together to the movie theater and they watched the movie together. And everybody else in the audience was confused why all these people were cheering for about a 5 or 10 second segment of the movie, which is when the Stealth Station S8 showed up in the movie. Anyway, some other predictive engineering product successes. I'm going to show you one about e-ink in a moment. I'm going to show you a couple of ones from the earliest DFSS project in a moment, and some other things from Motorola. I already showed you something about Micra, which I mentioned earlier on, but let's go on. So predictive engineering for ink display. When I was at Motorola, we invested in a startup company called e-ink, and they were working with an outside company, a customer, who looked at the iPod at the time, and they said, hey, the iPod, you have a user interface, pulling songs as data into memory, and then putting it out through an earpiece. We'd like to do the same thing, but with books. So similarly, a good user interface, pull things from an ebook database into memory, and put it now, you can't put it on sound, you'd have to put it on a display. And they decided to think about this little startup company, e-ink, for the display. So we did a P diagram on the display, where the noise factors, where the control factors, and what are the key requirements. And basically, what we did was we optimized the display over 7 temperature ranges. This is overlaid. These are 8 requirements, mean and standard deviation of 8 requirements. So a total of 8 times 2, mean and standard deviation being the 2, 8 times 2, 16 requirements overlaid for each of 7 temperature ranges. So we would sense the temperature with a thermistor or with a diode. And then based on the temperature of the environment, we'd set up these settings to optimize the display. So we would meet all these 8 requirements, mean and standard deviation, reliably, dependably, for that temperature. And somebody went out into the freezing cold, it would still work. And that is how we developed the display that would be robust for the original Amazon Kindle using the e-ink display. But the very first design for Six Sigma project that used predictive engineering was for a CMOS logic family. We looked at the original design that we're coming up with, and we used this predictive engineering, and we predicted the yield. We saw the yield would be about 57%, which is what we got. And we said, hey, let's try some different things in simulation, looking at it, probabilistically, and said, wow, if we went to a different output buffer design, we could have a flatter area, wider range of areas where we could have good yield, close to 100%. If we changed the substrate doping, we could also flatten a portion of the curve. What if we did both? Wow, if we did both, we could be robust against L-effective and threshold voltage variation. Manufacturing variation wouldn't affect it. We'd always have pretty high yield. So we did it, and we increased our yield from 56% to 96%, and we did that now afterwards for 57 first pass successes in a row, all first pass successes, all introduced together in about half a year, which set a Motorola record for new product development, which led to hundreds of millions of dollars in sales and profits. Around that time, Motorola had an internal competition called TCS, Total Customer Satisfaction. Out of 6,000 teams, This first DFSS project won the gold medal, which you see over here, signed by the CEO of Motorola at the time. So when later on we started using it across more of Motorola, and one of our executives, Bob Epson at Motorola, said, "Hey, we're going to use DFSS for all new products." And people on the staff said, "Well, what's it going to impact in terms of schedule? Is it going to slow everything down?" He says, "I don't care. It's the right thing to do." And all the people came to me afterwards. All the managers, executives said, "Hey, we're concerned about it." So I said, I made him a promise. I said, "I'll keep track of the first 10 or so projects that use predictive engineering DFSS, and I'll get the project manager to tell me what the impact is. I'll share it with you." And it was actually a pleasant surprise to me. 2/3 of the time, it had a favorable impact on the schedule, according to the project managers. A third of the time didn't have any effect, favorable or in fact favorable on the schedule, and they didn't have any cases where it had an unfavorable impact on the schedule. That was frankly a pleasant surprise for me. I actually thought it would have some impact. And you have the actual names of the black belt candidates and their projects and the schedule impact, the actual data on the slide. So Bob Epson said, basically, if you do the job the right first time, the probability of problems become smaller. You don't have to dive and catch. And then he said, "Hey, in 2007, our investment in quality improvements using predictive engineering designed for Six Sigma new products is paying off." Here's his graph. Here's his actual graph. And I pulled it into Minitab. So this is before using predictive engineering, the number of post-launch issues, and this is after starting using predictive engineering. And I turned it into Minitab. The median before we used DFSS was 7, and after was 2, a 3.5-fold reduction, and that's statistically significant, p-value of 0, no matter how you analyze it, whether you analyze it in terms of means or medians or the counts of failures. Similar thing happened at Medtronic in CRHF. I'm almost out of time, right? I have 9 minutes left. We applied that to CRHF, a whole bunch of products. We saw a reduction in development time from 27 months to less than a year for iterative programs, and a 25% improvement from 4 years down to 3 years for new platform products. In RTG, organizational success, we used DRM to help drive down field corrective actions. There's the number of field corrective actions versus time. We drove it down to a third of what it was before. At the same time, improved our predictability of being on time and on budget, achieved 92% on time and on budget. And we dropped our speed, our development time roughly in half using this predictive engineering approach. So that's kind of my summary: predictive engineering from deterministic to stochastic modeling to develop compelling new products. And I guess I'll open the floor for our last 8 minutes or so for questions.
Thank you very much, Eric, for that very nice, presentation, especially when you show that the models on the pictures, those models.
Yeah, that was, they were cute, weren't they? Look, had a question to me.
I see some question here. Let me read one by one, Eric, and then I'll let you respond. The first question is: great way to look at the probabilistic methodology for the medical application. My question is this generally done for design outputs only? Specific example which also uses this model to generate design inputs?
Well,
always treated as more theoretical.
So I guess I'm not too sure about the question on design inputs, but basically we do the DRM process, which I'm focusing on the predictive engineering, which is more the output, but the DRM approach does get involved with helping us to generate design inputs. We gather the voice of the customer, and then we turn them into measurable inputs in a very rigorous kind of method, and that helps us define our design inputs, and also helps us. We have a methodology to help to set up the spec limits that are part of the design inputs. So that's part of a broader methodology. But actually, in terms of predictive engineering, if we know what the outputs are, we can use it to drive backwards to see what the specs limits need to be on the design inputs. So, and I've actually done a case of doing it both with Monte Carlo simulation, with optimization, and also with Bayesian methods. So I hope that kind of answers your question a little bit. I saw there's a question before that as well, Christian. I see that you used RSM in some of my examples here. There's a benefit that are using RSM over other types of DOE. So I actually have one of our first examples of using predictive engineering at Medtronic was on a transformer that was Julie Dobbins' black belt project, and she did everything with DOE because there was no curvature. If there's no curvature, and you can detect curvature if you put a set point, as I had in my example for microfixation, you can detect curvature. In her case, where she was looking at optimizing the transformer for a defibrillator, there was no curvature or no significant curvature, so she did everything with DOE. And we had another case of a product that was endovascular for going into the blood vessels close to the aorta. in terms of devices, and they were able to optimize that one only using design of experiments because everything was linear, so you didn't have enough curvature. You need to have a polynomial or quadratic. So the advantage of RSM is that you can have a more complicated equation than a linear model, if that makes sense. Good to see you again, Jim. Nice to see you, Motorola days. Deja vu all over again. Other questions?
All right. Another question here is great way to look at the probabilistic methodology for the medical application. My question is
Well, I think it's what we already read.
Oh, is this the same? Okay. All right.
Yes.
Sorry. Let me see what is the question.
Any other questions?
Any other questions here, team? Okay, I'll leave the 1 minute. You can, team, you can, or participants, you can unmute your mic also as well, if you need to. Okay.
Thanks, Jay. Thanks, Jim. Yeah, I have a little bit less hair than I think when you knew me, and it's a little bit gray, but actually a lot grayer and a lot less hair.
Nice.
Like us all. Very good. All right, folks.
All right. If there's no questions, Eric, any last comments or before I close this meeting?
No, but I encourage people to learn more about this. You can see it's very powerful, and the FDA is, for those of you at EMBS thinking about medical applications, the FDA has been remarkably receptive to this. They love this kind of stuff. In fact, they actually have a new approach to work with medical device companies where they're kind of starting to give people extra credit for doing this. They actually have kind of an assessment based on the CMM approach to evaluating, and the evaluation levels 4 and 5 involve using statistical and probabilistic methods like this. So they're very receptive to this FDA overall. So it not only helps to get the market faster, but it helps the FDA be more confident.
Yeah, I would say I tried some of this strong tools like RSM. Based on my experience, they save us more than a year of developing.
Oh, super, excellent.
Yep. To close this out, thank you again, team, for attending, or participants, for the books, and for the people that is interested to join. Eric also have books that I will be sending through the list. And also I'll be sending Eric's contacts, email contact, just in case you have some future questions to him. I'll be sending it to you also. So to close this out, Eric, thank you very much for presenting this. We are really glad that you have spare your time on this. We will probably contact you in the near future to extend these kinds of analysis. Everything.
All right, thank you. Have a wonderful day. Have a wonderful evening.
You too. For the participants, have a wonderful evening or morning, and we'll see each other again next month. All right. Goodbye now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.